sixth episode of NGBE Live. In this episode, we have Juri Strumpflohner, who will teach us about automating for speed and quality with the new NX Dev Kit. Welcome, Juri. But before we
Hey,
dive in,
welcome.
Hey, you're welcome. Thank you for joining, Juri. And we have our panelists for today, Maarten Tibau, who's now not on the screen. And we have now he is, there is Maarten. And we have some Vloeberghs. Welcome, Maarten. And some, we normally also had Yannick, but he got sick this evening. So best of luck, Yannick. Hope you get well soon. So for today, we have one special guest for you, Juri. Juri, which you probably all know, is a software developer and an architect for more than 10 years. He's currently working as a JavaScript architect and engineering manager at Narwhal, where he consults for some of the world's biggest companies around the world. Juri is a Google developer expert in web technologies and Angular, speaks at international conferences, teaches on egghead.io, and writes article on his blog, juri.dev, which is visited by more than 1 million people per year. That is super impressive, Juri. Juri is a core member of NX, a smart and extensible build framework that we all know and love, and that helps us architect, test, and build Angular, React, and Node applications at scale. And that is exactly what Juri will be talking about today. One of the main strengths of NX is that it integrates really well with a variety of different tools in a very seamless manner, allowing developers like us to focus on producing features and business value instead of focusing on tooling. And much of these productivity gains can be achieved through three things, which is executors, generators, and plugins. And NX comes with different packages that already have all of these built in, allowing us to invoke them via either the CLI or the console to optimize our daily workflow. But we can even go much further and write our own custom ones. And that is what Juri will teach us today. He will teach us about the newly released NX Dev Kit and show us how we can leverage the new API to create our own custom generators, executors, and plugins in our own NX workspaces. If that doesn't get you excited, I don't know what will. Juri has agreed on taking questions after his talk. So if you have any questions, please head over to the live chat on the YouTube page and you can submit your questions right there. We'll be happy to ask them on your behalf right after Jussi's talk. So, and while you're there, please also leave some claps for Juri and let's give it up for Juri Strumpflohner.
Thanks. Thanks for this super long, cool introduction. So let me switch over and share my screen straight ahead. All right. Can you see my screen?
Absolutely.
Cool. If there's anything not working, please just let me know, because obviously being on a live stream, if I got hung up sometimes, just ping me. All right, so what I would like to talk about today, as Jurgen mentioned, is generators, executors, and plugins, and specifically look a bit more about the speed and quality that we can achieve with the NX Dev Kit. And so to get started, who am I? Jurgen already explained it quite in details. My name is Juri. I'm from Northern Italy. I'm a Google developer expert, instructor at Egghead, and also Cypress ambassador. Currently, I work at Narwhal already for almost 2 years as a JavaScript architect and engineering manager, and I'm also part of NX core team there. So today, let's look into using NX for specifically speed and quality by automating things, right? And in particular, that is basically by enhancing either existing of those generators, which we're going to explore, tailor them basically down or to our own needs within our organization, obviously by using NX. So what does the automation fundamentals look like? So in an NX workspace, you could, this is obviously a very simplified visualization here, but basically at the very bottom, we have the Narwhal Dev Kit, which is our version of a developer kit that will allow you to write such generators, executors, and plugins in general. And we're going to dive a bit deeper into all of these three today. So let's start with a generator. So what is an NX generator? An NX generator is simply something that operates on top of your workspace files, and it either creates new files, it modifies new files, or it deletes newer existing ones. And it doesn't really produce any output. So it just operates on your workspace files directly. And so types of generators can be those that already ship with NX. And so, for instance, if you're using Angular, those come baked into the now Angular package, or if you're using React or Next.js, those come in via those respective packages. So you need to first have those packages installed, and once they are installed, they will be made available to that specific workspace. We also have migration generators, and those are basically invoked during the NX migrate phase. So NX, similar to also the Angular CLI, has automatic migrations or updates whenever you migrate between different versions. And what runs there is nothing else than a generator. And finally, we have the workspace generators. Those are basically the ones that you can have within your own custom workspace. So they are just local to that specific environment. They don't necessarily are published and shared with someone else. So how does it work for such a workspace generator, which is the one we are most interested in today, because that allows us to really tailor down, as I mentioned before, some behavior to our own needs within the organization. So basically, in a NX workspace generator, what you have is you have such a virtual tree. And the virtual tree is just an abstraction of your file system. And basically all of our operations which are basically running in that generator run, first of all, against that virtual tree. And this has a couple of advantages. And first of all, we don't corrupt the file system. We don't write something and then get an exception. We have a state which is in between the correct state, basically, and the starting state. So whenever there's an error, it can be easily rolled back. And moreover, we have the possibility to simulate the run with the so-called dry run flag and see what would happen if we run the migrate, the generator. Next, we also have a schema. And that's kind of metadata for our generator, and it describes basically the properties it has. Usually for generators, that is what type of input properties does it allow or accept, what is their data type, descriptions for being visualized in a help for that generator, and also which ones are required. And you can kind of extend that schema further and customize it to have a much better user experience overall. So this is what is being validated against also when you invoke it. So whenever you call such a generator, NX is going to take the schema, take the arguments, validate it against the schema. If something goes wrong, like for instance, you have the required name and you didn't pass it to the generator, it would just stop and it would basically just throw an error and show an error to the user. Now, once this is validated, it actually invokes your own function, the generator function. And this is where then you come into play. That's where you implement your custom logic. You get the tree, you get the schema itself. And basically with that, you just implement the logic and return whatever you need to return or apply to your workspace. Finally, the output of that is then run against the virtual tree. If everything goes well and you didn't use the dry run, it will then be persisted onto the file system. So far for the generator logic. And then the generator logic itself can be very simple. As I mentioned, everything runs against that tree. So these are some of the operations you can have there. You can just kick off the Visual Studio Code IntelliSense and then look through the different options. But you see options for reading on the file system, verifying whether something exists. So it's really just an interaction with which you would expect with a typical file system API. Within the custom logic itself, as I mentioned, the logic can be from very simple, so just composing existing generators into a bigger logic, to something much more advanced where you kind of get a naive string replace. So basically you just read the content, you do a search and replace, maybe with a regular expression, and you update the content onto the file system. And then if you need to get more complex, because you have a more sophisticated case, then you can look into actual ASTs, which is so-called abstract syntax trees, which allow much more granular control over the code base. So let's have a look here and do some actual demo. And what I would like to do here is actually start and create such a generator, workspace generator. Now I'm using, and by the way, is the font size big enough for the hosts on the screen? Should be, I guess. So in terms of the workspace generators, you can either just use your CLI, or you can actually go and use NX Console. And NX Console is very handy because like you don't need to know the commands out of your head, especially when you start using those generators. And so you can just like install NX console into Visual Studio Code, run that or click that generate button up here, and then do like Workspace Generator. And so down here we see the Workspace Generator. And so let's call this my first generator. So now what happens is down here you see the generator runs and it uses the dry run mode. And so NX console here in this case just simulates the run of this generator, right? And you see like it would create here these files and update the package JSON. And so you can hit run, or you could also copy this into your clipboard and actually execute it on your terminal, especially if you need to create multiple ones. It's obviously much faster. And so you can just hit here run, and we'd go and install all the packages that are needed and required for the generator to run. So it performs here an install task behind the scenes. Meanwhile, we can go and have a look. And so what happened here is it generated a new generator within that tools generators folder. So here's my first generator. We got that generator function, which you have just seen before, and also that schema JSON. And so if you look at the schema JSON again, this is exactly what we have seen. So we have here a name property. Name property is required, so we need to provide it in order for successfully running this generator. You have the type here, which is string, but it can be much more advanced. Like you can have like an array. You can even have multiple types, different types, depending on the input. So you can really like create much more fancy schemas here. For our simple case here, this would be enough. What I usually also do then is to type that schema as it comes in here. And so what we can do here is define an interface and call this my first generator schema. And it has a name string. So I can just go ahead and use that in here. And so that will be what I can now I have basically a much more type safe environment, right? And this schema interface here should correspond to whatever we have in that schema JSON. And so if we inspect what we got here auto-generated is, first of all, we got here that library generator. So this is nothing else than a function that gets invoked from some other package. In this case, it comes from the now Workspace Generators. And so this is already another generator which we are invoking. And here you also see a bit like the power and the kind of simplification which we wanted to do with the novel Devkit is invoking other generators is really just invoking a function. Like it's nothing crazy. Usually you have to avoid it because like it's an async operation potentially. But we are just using native JavaScript features here. We have a utility function for formatting files. Again, you can see all of these come from that now Devkit. So that's where those common operations are being returned. And then we have here also an install task utility, which might be useful if your generator installs some new packages, like for instance, it modifies the package JSON. So you definitely want to perform an installation task after that. And this isn't a callback here because like, we don't want to run that for every generator, especially if we run multiple ones in sequence, but we want to do that once at the very end, right? If multiple generators actually require such an installation task. Cool. So we could actually go ahead now and implement something a bit more, let's say, sophisticated. First of all, let's try and actually see whether we are able to invoke the generator. So I'm actually importing here a logger from the novel Devkit, and that will allow me to, for instance, print out some info. Right? And we actually could even go ahead and customize this and do something like schema.name, right? So we pass in the value from the schema and we log it out to the console. So invoking that generator is nothing else than invoking NX, Workspace Generator, my first generator, the name which we gave it. We give it a name, which is NGB. And let's also use dry run. In this case, it doesn't really matter because we don't really change anything or run anything. And so here you see hi there, NGB, based on what we return. So invoking the generator works. Obviously, this is a very simple case. We want to do something more interesting. And so let's here create, or let's basically have a scenario where we want to generate a library and we want to create a custom README, right? This is probably a very simple case, but still shows different functionalities. So I could have here files folder. And in that files folder, I'm adding here a readme md. And so that readme md could be something like welcome, hi there. And then we use some templating syntax here. And let's use your conference name, for instance. The templating syntax which we're using here is called AGS. So you can actually find it on ags.co. And that's a quite simple and yet powerful templating syntax. So you can have like a couple like conditional statements and much more. So definitely just go to their website and kind of explore the possibilities which you have here. So in terms of our template, this would be good. This would be enough. And then what we definitely want to do is actually generate those files, right? And so again, to do that, I'm using here a generate files function. And so you can already see kind of the pattern, right? Like most of those utility functions come out of the null Devkit. I'm just running generate files. It takes a tree. That's also how you usually recognize those generator functions. They always take that tree because, like as I mentioned initially, that's where the operations are run against, right? They don't run natively on the file system. Then you need the source folder. And for the source folder, we can just do join path fragments because like this would be the dir name and the local files here, which we are having. Then we have the target. So where do we want to generate this? So this will be wherever we generate our library. So let's for now just add an empty string here. And finally, we would have the substitutions. So the substitutions, let me jump here back. Would be, and based on our template, we use the conference name variable there. And for the value of the conference name, we would want to pass in the schema.name. So that's what you want to replace there. Now let's have a look at the target. Like where would we generate this function to? Or where would we want to have that file, in this case, the readme, generated to? And we want to generate that to the library which we create. And so for that purpose, let me just reuse that library generator, which you have already here. It already takes a name. Now, the only thing we might want to do is actually make sure the name is a valid name, which is usually one that is separated by dashes. And so again, here we can use a handy function. So let me call this valid name equals, and here we import our utility function, which is names. Names provides me a callback where I can pass in the schema.name in this case. This would then give me a couple of callbacks here. So we can get like out of the name that got passed in, it formats it for me as a valid class name, as a valid constant name, a valid file name, a valid name in general, a valid proper name. So here we can use a file name, which has the dashes. That will work perfectly for us. And so again, here we might want to change this with valid name. And also down here, we want to do valid name. We could choose different variations depending on what we actually want to use. So here we have now our generator that generates our library. So far, so good. Now we know that here we have just an empty string for the target, and that's actually where we would want to have our readme be generated. Now, if we generate a library, what would we want to have is like in that library, usually we have like a root folder and a source root, right? And depending on where we want to have our readme, we would choose one over the other. And so we would want to actually read the root folder of that generated library. And we can do that again by using a function which is called read project configuration. And so again, down here, we can actually read the project config. Let's actually call this the root folder. Read project configuration of the tree again. The name of the project would be valid name. And that now returns me actually different properties of that project. You can see everything is nicely type safe. So you can just like use the root folder here. Go down here now, actually just use the root folder as the target for where we want to generate the files. Finally, we also want to format the files. And that's something we definitely want to do whenever we touch the file system. I want to make sure that based on the preview rules that are set up already in our workspace, those will be formatted accordingly. Cool. And so now that we have this, we can actually go and try and generate this. So let's have a look again. Let's recall our workspace generator, call it ngb. Let's run this. And you can see now I'm using the dry run mode. So it would show me that it creates a lib ngbe with a readme and a couple other configurations here. So let me just remove the dry run. We dive in. And so it would output here me the ngbe library. Now let's go to the readme. And here we can see our overwritten readme file, which otherwise would be a generic readme file about this library being generated and the name of the library. So we can see it actually worked. So far in terms of the generator. Now, as I mentioned, useful links in terms of the generators, what you can find is definitely on the NX Devkit API. So either on GitHub directly, and this would be a pointer directly into the source code of what gets exposed. And those are mostly the functions which you have seen, like read workspace configuration, read the project configuration. There are also functions for updating the project configuration and much more. So usually everything that we use within NX for our own plugins, we have it also at disposal and exposed over the Devkit API. As I also mentioned, like if you have obviously a more complex scenario and need to look at ASDs, don't be scared. They look very intimidating initially, but as you look a bit closer, there are actually also some helper functions. Like there is a package called tsquery, which is really, really handy for querying basically in a query, like DOM query fashion, your attributes of your source code. And based on that, basically then grab nodes and update those specific nodes. There are quite some good examples there. Also, definitely check out ASD Explorer and the tsquery Playground, as those are really helpful in understanding like which is actually the name of the node I'm targeting, like how it is called based on the source code example. And finally, also check definitely out our NX generators on GitHub. We have obviously tons of those, which I mentioned initially for the core plugins. And so we do a lot of things there, like updating ng modules or removing files or changing files in very specific ways. So we probably have already had a case which you're facing. And so that's a good place to actually look in and learn at how basically some of those problems have been solved there. Use cases, again, is actually pretty obvious. Like it's mostly for whenever you have repetitive tasks, right? So whenever you have to set up like a library in a very specific way, for instance, also having a different README or having basically on top of each component kind of copyright like header or something like that. Like you can definitely use generators and just customize, for instance, a component generator and add your own stuff on top of it. So first use like the Angular generator to generate a component, and then on top of it, modify the file again and add your own things in there. So that would be basically augmenting existing generators. And also something that is often not considered is like those large scale refactorings. Like for instance, if you work at really large organizations where you have like hundreds and hundreds of commits that enter the main branch per day, upgrading, for instance, Angular or something in such workspace scenarios isn't just like a one thing, like you just like run it once and then that's it, right? Because like you cannot really tell everyone, well, you need to stop like migrating code or merging code for a week until we got to updated everything on master, and then you can kind of continue developing, right? So embedding or creating generators that actually refactor the code and migrate code is really handy, because like then all those branches which are not yet up to date can rerun those over time, like over the next couple of weeks, to also get updated. So definitely a scenario to be considered. So this has been the generators. Like then what is an executor? Like that's the second puzzle basically in that whole automation scenario. Now an executor, like contrast to a generator, is something that performs a task on top or computation on top of an NX project. So an executor is usually tied to a specific project, and it's not basically attached or operates like on a workspace level, such as a generator does, right? So you attach it to a project, and then it performs a task on top of that. That can be usually like the classic ones, like a build or a test run or linting, but you can really just set up any other custom task you want. And so how does it work in terms of like an executor? When you invoke it, you usually have like an X, of course, like the binary. Then you have the actual target you want to invoke and the project. So this would be the actual executor target, which in this case performs a test run. And this takes then into account a different set of, like, obviously configuration files. It takes into account the environment, the source files, some global configuration. And then within NX specifically, this is being passed to something that we could call, like, there isn't an actual coordinator in that sense, but we could call this kind of coordinating module that takes all these pieces and verifies, have you run this already against a similar scenario? If you have, it isn't being executed again. But basically, the coordinator would figure out this is cached, so let's just pull it out of the cache and write it onto the file system. So in that case, that scenario would already be concluded. You wouldn't continue to invoke your own executor. If that is not the case, we actually continue, and this contextual information is then passed on to our executor. So we have that contextual information, and another thing, another puzzle that comes in is the actual target configuration. So for instance, here in that builds tab, we have the name of the executor and options that can be passed to the executor. And those two things are then passed to our functions. So this is, again, similar to the generators, where we then go ahead and implement our logic based on the information which we got from NX. Once this is done, it is being passed to the coordinator again. That one stores it in the cache and also prints it out on the actual output folder that you specified. Use case here is obviously for automating computation. All right, like the usual scenario is like if you have like a lot of npm scripts that do complex stuff, or you invoke local node scripts that manipulate your workspace, it might be a very good case for actually migrating them to an executor. And the main advantage and benefit, as I've also put on this slide here, is in NX, the caching. Like every computation, every executor is also automatically cached, as we have seen. Like that coordinator phase basically would take care of that, while obviously your npm script or your node script wouldn't fall into that case. And you don't even have to kind of go full blown into like creating your own executor, but you can also, for instance, wrap as a first step those node scripts or npm scripts into the so-called run commands. And I've placed here a link where you can check out on our docs like how that works in detail. Now, before we actually go and have a look at like what could such a workspace executor be, let's also first check out the NX plugin, because like those are kind of correlated. So a plugin in the end is nothing else than a collection of both like the executors, which you have seen, and the generators. And the goal, obviously, of a plugin is to package this up and distribute it with others and share it with others, such that it cannot just be within your own workspace, but you can share it outside that workspace within your organization, or even like on an NPM with the community, basically. And so this is actually how I already had the initial picture. Like you have those plugins at the very bottom, kind of, which now bundle in the generators, which also bundle in executors, and potentially migrations, right? Like for instance, if you look at the novel React packages or Angular packages or Next and so on, those usually also come with migrations, such that like they update themselves as like NX updates itself, right? To make sure that our users don't have any large breaking changes. Again, let's go back here and look into a demo for the scenario. So what I want to do is, in order to basically go ahead and create such a plugin, first of all, we need to install the plugin. So let me actually just comment this first. We have it here as a fallback scenario. And then let me add novel NX plugin as a package. This will give us now the capability of developing a plugin locally in our workspace. Because like what we want to achieve now is something similar to the generators, like to a workspace generator. We want to create a workspace executor. So not necessarily something we want to share, although we could, but something that we could just run within our workspace, right? To abstract one of our complex, let's say, NPM scripts or node scripts, which we created. So here again, now the computation runs, and we have the package installed. Now again, I can use NX console and generate such a plugin. And so if I add here plugin, you can see the various options which I have. And right now I want to create a new plugin. And the name of the plugin is, I call it Workspace Extensions. And this is a way, for instance, for having a single library within my workspace, which handles all the kind of local automation scenarios which I want. And I leverage just the plugin because it provides me some nice functionality, which I can need for creating such a workspace executor. We can also place that in a shared folder, because that would be something shared across our workspace. And then we can just run and actually get this generated. All right, so let's have this compiled. Meanwhile, we can have a look at the libs. We can now see we got that workspace extension created here. It has executors. I already created such a build example executor. It has generators, and it also has like some more metadata down here, which like points to what kind of executors and generators are exposed by this plugin. Now, these are details. I don't want to spend too much time on them, but you can check them out on our documentation. But what we want to do now is we just want to basically use or reuse our build executor that got generated in this folder here and use it for our own purpose. All right, so what we want to do is we basically initially heard that like a workspace generator operates across the NX workspace, while an executor is usually attached to a specific library or task, like a project within our workspace. And so one thing we need to do, like once we have that workspace extension plugin created, we need to build it to be able to actually invoke it. And so I can just, since this is a normal project, the library within my workspace, I can just do nx build workspace extension. And I need to add shared because like it's in the shared folder. And so now basically it compiles it, and what it will create is it creates this shared workspace extensions, I think was the name, extension, in my folder here, right? And so we have like the actual compiled output of this. Now we can actually go and register this on a project and test it out, right? So I can go to my Angular JSON, and let's go, for instance, to our MGBE library. And here we have the linting and the testing, and we just want to add another task in here. Let's call this build. And what we actually might want to create, or what could be interesting here, is actually we have our NDB library from before, and so it would be interesting to have something that compiles our custom README into an actual HTML. And so I'm having here my build task. So I just defined this by hand for now. Let me copy this over actually, so we are faster. So every such target contains a builder. Now, in our case, it isn't obviously something from a package, but it's from the local file system. And so we would want to change this and actually point it to the outcome which you have just seen. So it would be dist, look here, would be dist libs shared workspace extension. And the actual target name here is called build, right? That was the executor which was in that extension. Then we have the output file here. As the options, we can add the actual output file if you want, or let's actually add an output path. Like that is what we actually have. That will be something like dist libs ndb. That's what we can use. Now let's actually go and implement that workspace executor. So we can close this here. We wouldn't want to need, or we don't need to actually change this anymore. And actually let me just do something and cheat a bit and copy in the workspace executor implementation. So we don't have to go like step by step, and you don't have to watch me typing. Now, first of all, you see here we have an error down here, which comes from that options builders executor schema. And the reason is here, it is an empty interface, and we have specified the output path. So let's just fix this. So TypeScript is happy. And so what we have here is we have our run executor function. That's the main one that's being invoked by NX whenever we run this executor. We again see this, these two like contextual information, which we have seen before on the slides, where we get our options, which can be configured in Angular JSON or passed as an argument. And then we have the context. And the context in this case is very handy for reading workspace information during our executor run. For instance, here, I'm getting the project root by just invoking here a property on the context, which is workspace. That gives me all the projects. And from there, I can, based on a project name, which is also coming from the context, get the actual root folder. So in that case, I get the root folder. I now just perform actual operations on a file system. So here we don't have anymore that tree or virtual abstraction, but we actually work on the file system. So I can just like use Node APIs to read, for instance, our README based on a project root. So I would go ahead and read out that README. It invokes a function markdown to HTML. So this is nothing like complicated, just use an external package to compile it actually. And then it, again, computes the output directory based on that output file, makes sure that exists, and writes the file, and returns success true, basically that the executor has successfully returned. Let's have a look and try this out. So first of all, let's build the workspace extension. And I need to add here shared. Like we changed it here, we need to build it first, so that it gets updated here in the dist folder. And now we can actually invoke the target which we have here specified on our NGB project, like the build one. All right, so we would do something like nx build NGB. This was then complete. Now let's go and have a look, and hopefully, and it worked. And yes, indeed it did. Like we have now a compiled HTML file based on our markdown file. Now this is all cool and interesting, but obviously you might wonder, okay, now I always need that dist folder to exist up here, right? Like if I do something like rf dist, which sometimes we do, right? Like because we want to clean some cached results, and I run the build task of nx build ngb again, it would fail because it cannot find the actual package anymore, because the workspace extension doesn't exist. Now we could use something like a post install command here, where we compile that first, but that would only compile obviously during an npm install, which we might not do like during the development, right? It might be something at the beginning of the day or whenever we update. There's actually another functionality which we can leverage here. And if you go into the next JSON, we have such a target dependencies build. And this is something that is being created by default whenever you set up a new NX workspace. And what it does is it simply defines target dependencies. So this does nothing, this means nothing else than whenever you invoke a build target on some project, also invoke the according build target on all of its dependencies. This is similar to some of you might recall, which we had previously, which is something like a with deps flag, which you could invoke, like something that would be nx build ngb with deps. But that's no more used, or you don't really need that anymore, because like this happens out of the box. And you could potentially add your own here, like your own custom dependencies or target dependencies. Now, one thing to notice here is that right now, our workspace extension here is not really a dependency of our NGB project. So it wouldn't be built anyway, right? It's like inside our NGB library, we don't really import the workspace extension. Now, this is also something we can fix by just specifying such an implicit dependency. We can go in here and say our workspace or our shared workspace extension, let me copy this here, is actually what we have as a dependency, right? And so now, for instance, whenever I build NGBE, you would see that first it would build basically the workspace extensions if they haven't been built, and then actually execute NGB. And so it would always kind of work. All right. So again, use cases in this case for like the plugin scenario in general is obviously sharing with the community, as I mentioned, but also what I showed today is kind of to create such a custom workspace executor, right? So going back just a second here, while, for instance, the generators here are kind of an out-of-the-box setup where you just run them and they will be compiled on the fly to the dist folder and executed from there. Right now, there isn't something equivalent for the executors. We're working on something similar, but what really works nicely right now is just using the plugin APIs. right? And using such implicit dependencies to hook them up. And obviously, if you have some really cool thing, just go ahead and share your with the community. And so that's actually also a good point, because like sometimes it might even already be there, right? So whenever you have some cool idea, make sure you also check first our NXDev community website, where we have listed all the officially supported community plugins, because like there are some really cool ones, and so you might either just like contribute to some existing one and that way give back to the community. So the takeaway which I would kind of give you for this talk today is kind of don't be afraid to dive into the whole executors and generators thing. And I think like the NXDev dramatically simplified things, because like you don't have to deal with like observables, which like I think is really nice for application development, but for just running like basically scripts or automation, it's not really necessary, right? And so we try to simplify a lot of these things within the NXDev kit. For instance, you have seen just invoking functions in the end is what you need, like to invoke other generators and to compose different generators together. Also, you don't always immediately need ASDs. There are other solutions for that. And if you need to, there are some cool packages that you can actually rely on. And finally, obviously, the quality improvements, I think, are enormous, especially if you're a large organization. Creating these automations can really help your team be faster in development, but you, at the same time, you also kind of guarantee some consistency on how libraries are being set up, how our application and components look like, and therefore also improve like the quality. Again, shameless promotion plug from my side. If you want to dive deeper into this stuff, I've created a free ACAD course. Now, this is here in the title, it mentions React, but it's really kind of framework agnostic. And X really operates just on top of these frameworks, automating stuff. So you could really just swap out React with Angular and generate the very same things with Angular and explore the capabilities of NX. Here is an example repository of what I did today. So you can go there and play around with it by yourself. And with that, I'd like to say thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Juri. Wow, this was amazing, eh? I took so many notes scrolling on my screen here. First of all, love the beautiful slides that you prepared. So really great
Cool,
work
thank
with
you.
that. Fantastic live coding as always. Yeah, amazing work, and thrilled that we now have our own custom NGBE plugin. Eh? Let's ship it. Can you publish it to NPM? And which was one of my questions, by the way. But we'll see if we have questions popping up from the chat. If not, I have about 10 questions that I would like to ask, but I'll give the word first to Sam and Maarten. Sam, do you have any questions? And Maarten, do you have any questions you'd like to ask?
I don't have any questions, but I have a bunch of ideas, more or less. So it's more or less coming together. It's really cool what you can do, and also generating HTML from Markdown already puts me in some kind of states. Now you can write Markdown blog posts and then create some kind of a generator and do it in a pipeline and then push it to the web, and then you have an HTML page and then stuff like that. So really cool to see, but yeah, my fingers are tickling to dive into that thing. So it was very, very interesting.
Awesome. Thank you, Maarten. Do we feel a static site generator coming up via an executor, or Maarten? Or is that
as if we don't have enough already?
Yeah.
the pile of domain names and projects I started is huge. The projects I finished is a bit less. So, but yeah, I think it's always cool to see these things popping up, and yeah, NX is really, or the whole thing, or all the people at Narwhal, whatever they are creating, it's so helpful for the whole Angular community and even broader than that. So I think we should be very thankful to the whole team, because we get these things for free, and yeah, they're very, very powerful. So in a daily web development life, it can be very, very useful, as Juri already said. So thank you actually for the presentation, but also for giving us those tools.
Yeah, that's very, very true. Plus 1 million for that one, Maarten. Thanks for the Norwell team as well, and super happy that they will come over and join us at NGB as well to give a workshop on how to use NX tools. Because I mean, it's so popular in the community, and rightfully so. And the tooling is incredible, and to have that all available for free is indeed a blessing and a luxury to have for the community. Thanks, Maarten, for your feedback. Sam, do you have any questions for Juri?
No, it's the same as Maarten. I think I'm pretty well known with what the capabilities are of those tools. It's the same thing. I need to find some projects or cool stuff that I can do with it to play with it. Yeah, and apart from that, I'm always very impressed with, for example, the migrations. How easily they can update your codes in between dependencies, like for example ESLint, stuff like that, storybook updates. Yeah, very impressed with that, and I'm very happy to be an NX Workspace user.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam. Indeed. And it's also very inspiring to see you live coding, Juri. It's like you make it seem so easy. It's like, hey, let's create a generator. So really awesome. I have about 10 questions. Hopefully you won't shoot me after the episode. But
No, that's fine.
if that's too much, if you need to run, feel free to run. So feel free to interrupt me. But I'll try and ask them on behalf of the community as well. First, a few questions on generators. Did I understand it correctly? Like generators are a bit the replacements for schematics then? Is that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So we don't.
Yeah. For those that come from the for those that come from the Angular community, like the schematics would be the generators and the builders would be like kind of executors, right? So we try to come up like with different names. Also to abstract a bit like the fact that you can use them wherever you want, right? Like at some point, like we abstract ourselves with the novel dev kit from the Angular dev kit. Obviously, a lot of the concepts, and that you can, as an Angular user, you can immediately see those, right? They are highly inspired by the Angular dev kit underneath, right? Like the whole like tree, the abstraction of the file system, the dry runs, whatever you can do. But at the same time, we wanted to like simplify things, right? We wanted to make it as simple as possible for newcomers to enter and create those generators. Like we have seen like a lot are kind of hesitant. So it seems like, oh, that's like kind of complicated, and like you need to kind of have those chain methods and chain things together, right? So we wanted to just simplify it and say, look, like it's just like a function you invoke, right? We have a bunch of utilities, you can create your own, and just stick them together, and like that's already enough, like to get such a generator running. So yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And also like not having the word Angular in the command probably makes it more clear that the command can also be run on a Node.js or a React project. And because otherwise,
I mean, like even the Angular dev kit schematics are kind of agnostic, right? They're not really tied to the Angular framework itself. But obviously having the name Angular there, I don't think a lot of people outside the Angular community are actually using them. It seems something just like for the Angular ecosystem, right? While it isn't really, right? It's just like running a bunch of generators. And the concepts behind are really, really powerful, right? So
cool. All right. That was the first question. Second question you briefly touched on it. So all APIs seem to be promise-based, not like no observables there. Is that on purpose? I love the simplicity, by the way, for tooling. That's awesome. So that's on purpose. That's going to stay that way as well?
Yeah, exactly. That was one of the simplifications we wanted to do, right? Because like, as I briefly mentioned, like within an Angular application, we Angular developers are accustomed to have like observables and like wrapping those together and piping them through a couple of operators. Like for us, it's very natural, right? But then at the same time, like we when we designed now dev kit, we were like asking ourselves, like, do we really need that complexity or that level of complexity within just basically if you want a node script, right? Like a script that runs through and like changes a couple of things, right? And so that was one of the main design goals, to just simplify things and rip out everything that we don't need, while everything is still backwards compatible, right? So even if you, and I didn't have the time to touch too much on that, like in the demo, but if you check out on our docs, like there are functions for converting basically an existing Angular schematic to a generator. So basically invoke an Angular schematic from within a generator and vice versa, right? So we have created basically kind of backwards compatibility layers between the two, so you can convert back and forth between them. And that also doesn't limit you really to kind of migrate everything to the new generators, right? Because like maybe you were one of those that have already a bunch of workspace schematics, if you want, right, in your NX workspace. So you can just like mix and match those, right? So you're not limited to one or the other.
Got it. That's brilliant. Yeah, I love the simplicity. And one of the examples you showed, like there was the generate files. So for the sake of the community. So that doesn't directly write the files, right? It's only when you do dry run or remove the dry run that it actually gets written. So even if you have dry run enabled, you generate files will not write them to the disk. It's only when you remove the dry run that it will actually, that the same function. It's not like at the end you need to say, now write everything to disk. No, it's the commands, have the same commands. It's only the dry run toggle. Yeah, got it.
Yeah, exactly. That's basically handled by the host, which runs, basically in that case, NX, which runs the generators. And that's also kind of a rule of thumb, which I always recommend. Like whenever you write generator code, you shouldn't really have Node APIs calls in there, right? Like checking the file system using just some Node APIs, right? You should always go over that tree object. And that's also a good thing to check, like whenever you import functions, also from the now Devkit, right? Like there should be just those functions that have the tree object or take the tree object as one of the most prominent parameters, like usually the first one, right? As a signal, like that's because the function needs that object to write on top of that, right? To create a file or whatever. And that's, for instance, the concept which we obviously took from the Angular Devkit, like that has been there already from the very beginning, that abstract object to make sure that we don't like mess up our file system, right? Like for instance, you run a generator and for some reason it fails. It's maybe not something you wrote, but like from an external plugin, right? But it messed up your file system. That's something you don't want. And so rolling back in case of errors is obviously very powerful there.
Awesome. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. In the utilities, so in the Devkit, are there also like utilities to update Angular JSON and NX JSON?
Yeah.
Like if you, so they're also included.
Yeah.
You can...
Exactly. Like if you go to the docs, there's the whole API. Also, like just like go directly maybe to the GitHub page to the barrel file for the Devkit export on the NX repo. There you can really see all the methods that are listed. And yeah, like there should be everything you need to update your local workspace, read project configurations, and all those things. And it also kind of, or actually you're highly encouraged to do that and not, for instance, read the workspace JSON or Angular JSON yourself, even not just over the tree object, because like we do a bunch of like even modification behind the scenes, right? For instance, there are different versions of like the Angular JSON or workspace JSONs, right? So we manage that for you, right? Like you have always the same API, but behind the scenes, you might want to write it in a different version of your file system, and therefore make sure that it always works. There's also something coming up, which is actually already released as a manual generator in NX, where you can split up your Angular JSON, workspace JSON into per project configurations, right? Like some of the things people kind of ask, if you have like a gigantic monorepo, right? Like if you open up the Angular JSON, it might like your IDE might start to suffer, right? And so one of the requests was actually to be able to split those up, right? And to pull the specific configuration into the actual library folders. And so by using those update workspace JSON or read project configuration or update project configuration methods from now Devkit, that will also take care of that to make sure it is being written to the right file, right? But otherwise you would have to figure it out by yourself, right? So it's basically much safer to go through that abstraction layer.
That is fantastic. So any project you touch, you use the utility function and it will write it to the correct place. And wow, that's awesome.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Fantastic. All right. There's also one question that I wrote down on Executors. So you mentioned, so the cache, fantastic. I love that idea. I was wondering, is it also compatible with the NX Cloud Cache? So if you have Cloud Cache enabled?
Yeah, absolutely.
It just works seamlessly? That's fantastic.
Yeah, exactly. Like the NX cache itself is already local always, right? Whenever you run something, it's on by default unless you deactivate it for some reason. But it caches all the operations. And NX Cloud is really just like a plugin on top, right? So whenever you plug that in, it would also be synced up to the cloud, such that like your coworkers can benefit from that. And that would work for your own custom operations as well, right? And that's always why I tell people, like, if you have those NPM scripts, or even what I usually see, like also in the tools folder, there's like another utilities folder in there in the NX workspace, which has a bunch of node scripts, which people then invoke from the command line. If you even just package them in a so-called run command, and if you look that up on our docs, that's basically a generic executor, if you want, like a pre-made one, which takes just an array of commands, which you can really most of the time copy and paste the scripts in there, right? And so if you make sure that the output is properly set there, those operations will all be cached, right? And they would also be synced up to the NX Cloud cache. Because that's really no difference rather than syncing up the local cache to a distributed container in the cloud.
Yeah.
And so that's the biggest benefit, absolutely, because like you don't really have to rerun the computation over and over again because like, it's already run before, right?
Yeah, that's super powerful indeed. And especially also for like larger orgs, enterprises that do stuff like that, you can just, wow, super interesting. And having that work out of the box is very impressive. On plugins, I saw you type NX command, workspace extension. Like, is extension then the plugin? Because I was a bit confused. Like, oh, so
that was just the name basically. I just called it Workspace Extensions because like,
okay,
it's kind of
which was
the name of a library because like, it's extending the local workspace, right?
Okay.
This specific example was not really something where I would kind of publish it somewhere, but it's just like similar to the Workspace Generators, kind of executors and generators for the workspace locally, right?
Okay, got it.
And right now, what you have seen, for instance, in the demo is I kind of compile it always, right? Like hooking it up as a dependency, it always compiles in your local workspace. And it is not super nice yet in the sense that you have to kind of reference it from the dist folder, right? And so we have already kind of thought about that when I initially like played around with this example to abstract this further, such that you could just like reference it via like path mappings, just as you do with the library. And you could just like have it like at like your local workspace scope / workspace extensions, something like that, and reference it straight away that way, right? So it would be really nice, just as you would link that workspace extensions library within another library, you could just hook them together, right? So this is an idea which we have and which we will most probably implement very soon. So it would make this whole demo even nicer because like then you really just like use it even in your configuration file.
Yeah, that's awesome, eh? That's super cool. So that was me misunderstanding the extension word for plugin. So thanks for clearing up that confusion. I have 3 questions left. 2 short ones. So the first one was, can generators and executors be tested? We didn't see that, but like, you build a generator. Can you like? Is there a way to test that, to have a spec file on that, or?
The workspace generators right now, as far as recall, like they're a bit different, like a bit more complicated in the sense that you have to kind of tweak a bit the tsconfig, which is right now in the tools folder, so that you can actually have tests and run tests against it. It's definitely possible. We don't generate it right out of the box. And so maybe if we improve, or that's kind of the idea, if we improve those like local plugins, the actual workspace generator could just become such a plugin that lives in your workspace, just as any other library, right? And so you have the same benefits, like the normal jest setup. It's not something like different, right? Right now it is kind of, right? Like, because like the workspace generator, for instance, lives in a tools folder, which like sharing things into the tools folder is kind of complicated. While within the libs folder or within that library ecosystem, it just works as all the other things work, right?
Yeah.
And so in the long run, it might go in that direction where it just lives as within a library. So you have all the jest set up. You can just write tests as you normally do. And actually, when you generate such an NX plugin, I've not shown it in the demo, but like it generated also a couple of test scenarios for you. So you can kind of explore those, right? Where it actually generates something, then it checks whether it actually exists on a file system and those kind of things. So yeah.
Awesome. And bit tying into that, when you said you can write your own custom plugins and you can publish them, is there a command like included to publish it as well? Or like, how would you publish your own custom plugin?
You can just, you can really just like build it as we did, right? And then like package it up as an NPM package and push it up to the NPM registry. And our people could then just like install it. And once they are installed, having those generator.json and executor.json metadata files, NX console as well as NX are able to parse them. And so once you have installed them, they would pop up as generators or executors within your workspace. But the best is actually, the best is actually just to go to nx.dev/community, and there should be links to like documentation how you write plugins. I think there's even a video that kind of guides you through like setting up your own plugin, as well as instructions for actually publishing them. It's like one thing we recommend to the community is actually submit them, such as they are listed on that NX Dev community page. We usually, like those submitted ones are not something that we kind of actively maintained by ourselves, but are maintained by the community. But it's something where we looked over whether it matches the best practices, whether it has like test cases written for it. Like we kind of try to guarantee a certain quality. And that's also why it's kind of like official community plugins, right? So we highly recommend people to submit it to there. But you don't have to, right? Like you really could just push it up on an NPM registry or wherever and include it in your workspace.
Fantastic. We're nearing the hour. I have one more question left, but it's more like
Yeah,
a
sure.
personal, inspirational question. We've seen you grown so much over the years, Juri. It's super inspirational. Maarten touched up on it as well. You're a world-class consultant, a trainer. You have an awesome blog. You have a great newsletter, by the way, that like people, if you want to sign up, I'm a subscriber there yourself. Love
I need to
the
write
stories
more,
that you share. Well, that's what we all have, right?
Always
So you're an egghead instructor. You just recorded another. I mean, you keep publishing awesome stuff. You're a great person on top. You kind of radiate this calm. You never seem to be worried, and you're never stressed. Like, how do you succeed in being so productive and calm? And I think, as Maarten said, we all have domains. We have all started so many projects. It's hard to finish them, but you seem to know the secret to finishing. Like, what's your secret and being so productive?
Oh, I'm actually struggling as well. Just probably don't show it as much. Like, I guess we all struggle. That's always kind of it always boils down to priorities in the end, right? So what I usually do, like that's something that works out for me. It's kind of set goals for myself, like half-year goals or something, and evaluate against my priorities, right? Like whenever you come up with like, oh, that would be a super cool project, right? Then you have to actually kind of contract with yourself, right? Like, is that something which I can match against my priorities, which I have defined, my goals, or not, right? And otherwise you need to park it. Like, it's hard, it's tough, but like sometimes it's something you need to do. Like we all know, like especially if you have family and like sports and stuff, like there's only so much time, which is also a good thing, right? Like we would definitely want to enjoy our free time as well. So
for sure. Yeah, love that idea. Do it or park it. That's Maarten, we know what to do.
Fake it until you make it.
Exactly.
It's not exactly that. It's more like saying no to leave room to say yes, because everything you say yes to is saying no to something
but
else.
I
right?
think Juri made a very good remark, like making some kind of a contract or writing stuff down, making something visual, and indeed telling yourself no at certain points. Like I think that's a very good advice. Accepting that things cannot be done right now, and it's okay, and you can do it at a later stage as well. But if you have written them down, you can always go back. Now I have the time. Now I maybe can pick this up. So I think that's very good advice.
Absolutely. Yes. Can only attest to that. So thank you so much, Juri, for being here with us today. Super inspiring. And thanks also to the Narwhal team by proxy for bringing such awesome tooling to the community for free. This is amazing, and we can only be happy with so much tooling around this. And also for taking it further, not just Angular community, but also the React and the Node community, that they also benefit from all these tooling. This is wonderful. So I definitely learned a lot. Hopefully others in the chat, and Maarten and Sam, you also learned new things. Super excited to hear that. Maarten, you're also excited to try new stuff, build a contract with yourself.
I'm always excited. That's my problem.
Yes, but put some stuff on the parking lot, and then make sure to be excited about the one that you want to finish, and looking forward to what you will build with the knowledge that we learned today. So thanks again, Juri. Before we jump off, Juri, where can people find you? You mentioned it briefly, Juri.dev. Is that the way?
Yeah, exactly. Juri.dev is the best way to find me, or on Twitter, JuriSTR. If you have questions, just ping me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Juri. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks everyone for watching the recording. We hope you had a great time and learned something new. Have an awesome day. Have an awesome evening, and see you again in the next episode. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.